Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Cryptic Conversations. I'm your host, Tunes from the Crypt, and we have another very special guest in store today. Today's guest is a man named Rick Levine. Rick is a world-renowned astrologer, author, and scholar who co-founded StarIQ.com and is a founding trustee of Kepler College. He co-authored 8 years of Barnes & Noble's Your Astrology Guide and is known for his daily horoscopes that reached millions of readers online for nearly 20 years. Rick has also authored several books on astrology, and in addition to his writing, he is a popular speaker and teacher and has presented at conferences and workshops throughout the United States and abroad. Rick is comfortable writing mass market sun sign astrology while also pushing the technical and theoretical boundaries of the profession. His teachings on YouTube have reached tens of thousands of astrology students around the world. Welcome, Rick.
Hey, nice to be here. Wherever here is these days. It used to be easy when you said, nice to be here, you were here. But now, where the hell is here?
Cool. Well, thank you for joining on this episode. We can just dive right in. Talk to me about your early life. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? And what your family was like?
Got it. Well, I took the Peter Pan oath as a youth. I've never grown up. I refuse to grow up. I won't grow up. And yet I seem to have become older anyhow. I'm in New York City. I'm a Bronx boy by birth.
Got it.
And I had the luck of growing up in what was then a small town about just under 200 miles north of New York City, Saratoga, New York, Saratoga Springs, which was a very cool place to be a kid. And, had a pretty normal family life, except I was always the one that was different. And, and who's to say who was normal back then, but it certainly was, I was certainly different and still do my best to do that. But even as a youth, I was always interested in reading shit that I wasn't supposed to read, whether it was science fiction or books about UFO or hypnotism or psychic stuff or, UFO, anything that was outside of acceptability, I was in.
Yeah.
And I went to college actually to be a math teacher. I love geometry. And you combine geometry with a little bit of good sex, drugs, rock and roll, some good acid, and you come out an astrologer.
Oh, man, I love that answer. So did you go to college in New York?
I went to Stony Brook University and have a BA in psychology. And kind of thought I would just go on and get a PhD in psychology, but I kind of discovered astrology through explorations in Jungian psychology, and thought I would. By the time I graduated with a BA, I was done with academia. I mean, I've been studying and reading and learning ever since, but not from someone else, or not from a particular program guiding me down some channel of, you got to believe this to take this program.
Yeah. So I'm curious, were you fascinated with the cosmos and the universe as a kid? What inspires you to become an astrologer, and how'd you get started in this field?
Well, again, as I was reading all these things, astrology was just another thing, like astrology and numerology and psychic discoveries, and it was just all fair game. It was all kind of taboo, and that's what excited me. But it really wasn't until I was I went to college, and it was at the tail end of the 60s, so it was like the height of what I call the crazy years, and astrology was happening. And so I began to, be aware of it, but never really thought about being an astrologer. But the more I learned about it, the more it kind of took over from all the other things. And it was like, wait, there's something here going on that's not just excluded and on the outside. there's something here that's important.
Mm.
And it was actually my senior year of psychology studies that someone gave me a book by a Frenchman who actually came to the United States. His name was Dane Rudyard, and he wrote a book called The Astrology of Personality. And the subtitle was something like, you think I would learn this? I don't see the book up here on my shelf. The subtitle was something like a reevaluation of astrology in light of 20th century psychology and philosophy.
Okay.
And it was basically about Jung and Jung's psychology,
Uh,
and which most people didn't know then. I mean, we knew from his published writings that he was interested in astrology, but until his unpublished stuff came out in the form of his Red Book and other things, over the last decade, no one really, I think, understood how deeply driven Jung was by astrology, and
uh,
what we call Jungian psychology, he
yeah.
called analytical psychology, or the psychology of four types. And the four types of personality were thinking, intuitive, feeling, and emotional. I'm sorry, I
Ah,
did two. It's thinking, feeling, intuiting, and sensing. Those are the four types. And he based that on the four Greek, what they called the humors, which were based upon the four Greek elements: fire, earth, air, water, which is the basis of modern astrology.
ah,
And so, as I began to read this book, I realized that astrology wasn't just like a cool shit parlor game that somehow worked. I mean, it works. But it really was the kind of background motivational fabric of most of what was driven in the West as science, healing, psychology, medicine, astronomy. I mean, it was all originating in astrology. And so by the time I graduated, I was hooked, and I
yeah,
didn't quite know how it would all come together. And I did have some other, careers or jobs along my checkered past.
yeah,
But astrology has maintained itself as my primary, concern, and my
mm,
sole source of income for at least the past 2 decades or so,
yeah.
but an important part of my income and professional life for, 40 years.
Wow, I love it. Yeah, it's interesting to me. Like my last guest was very impacted and very interested in Carl Jung, his work, and I'm hearing it more and more. Like I'm hearing more about him lately, and I'm surprised. I'm realizing that he had such an impact on today's modern world with psychology and everything.
Well, and it
So
goes wider than psychology because because I think the torch bearer, if you want to call it that, of Jungian psychology,
Freud,
um, huh?
Freud.
No, no, no.
Oh,
Well, Freud was really the pre-Jungian energy, and Jung studied with Freud a bit, but never completely embraced that system.
uh,
Although, quite frankly, Freud is more important than most moderners would like to admit, because he was so politically and culturally and socially different than we are today. People like to just dismiss Freud, but without Freud, there would be no Jung as we know it. And
mhm.
without Freud, there would be no depth psychology. There would be no, none of the concepts like projection and ego and all these things were all Freudian concepts.
Yeah.
Freud wrote The Interpretation of Dreams in the 1890s, and that book changed everything. I mean, there was no such thing as the unconscious.
Ah,
Freud, kind of brought that out. But the torchbearer, the kind of lineage holder of Jung after Jung died, was a man named James Hillman, who kind of he taught at Pacifica in California, and he kind of changed the name of what we called Jungian psychology or psychology to transpersonal psychology,
Got it.
And he wrote a book called 100 Years of Psychoanalysis, and no one seems to be getting better.
Got it.
And kind of shifted the focus from the individual more to the collective or the cultural. And we have terms like archetypes and
Mm.
the whole integration of mythology into astrology. So astrology is very different today than it was 50 years ago, before it kind of really mated with modern psychology or Jungian, post-Jungian psychology.
Perfect. Yeah, you're beginning to talk about my next question, but real quick, I would like just real quick, how would you define astrology to the layman, to the beginner? How would you define it, and what are some common misconceptions people have about it?
Okay, so I would define it by quoting from the Lord's Prayer, which is the most recited prayer probably on the planet, but I don't think anyone who recites it actually even thinks about it or believes what they recite. But it's in the Lord's Prayer, it says, "It is done on earth as it is in heaven."
Oh wow, you're right.
That's
Wow.
all that's all astrology is. Period. Beginning, middle, end. Astrology is the study of the relationship between what happens here on earth and what happens in what the ancients called the divine proportion, that realm which was for God only, the cosmos, which, until Johannes Kepler came up with laws of planetary motion, there was that entire realm was outside of human logic. It was reserved for God. And so we've, in the beginning in the early 1600s, with Kepler's laws of planetary motion, that really began a period when humans kind of stepped into the realm which was reserved for God prior to that. But
Wow.
astrology is just the study of the correlation between the very small and the very large. The basic concept behind astrology comes to us from an ancient Egyptian tablet called the Emerald Tablet, which is allegedly written by a man named Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes the thrice times great. Hermes the three times great. Hermes, which is Greek for Mercury, which is Latin for the planet of communication. And the Emerald Tablet basically said this, amongst other things. It said, "As above, so below. The within of things is as the without of things." That's the part that's usually not, everyone knows as above, so below, but it's the inside is the same as the outside. And in a way, what this sets up is the concept that the microcosmic explorations of the subatomic realms are actually the same as what's at the absolute macrocosmic, the astronomical cosmic realms. And in fact, it is in some ways part of my work, my contribution to astrology is this concept of what I like to call quantum astrology, because all of those things that freaked the hell out of scientists in the early 1900s, that were just breaking the laws of what they thought the universe was, what's now known as quantum physics, all of those things exist at the macrocosmic level too, which brings astrology back into the scientific realm. Whereas with the Newtonian mechanics, astrology was just laughed out of academia because it made no sense.
Jeez. Man, I'm loving this so far. Okay. So you touched on it for a second there. So you mentioned Kepler. And there's many that come to my mind. So there are various notable astronomers throughout history. Which are your favorites and why?
Astronomers?
Astrologists, sorry. Or astronomers, yeah, astronomers.
Well, I mean, going back to what most people consider to be the first astronomer, was an Egyptian, a Greek actually, named Claudius Ptolemy. And
Yeah.
Ptolemy actually wrote a series of books that were kind of, one was kind of a compendium or codification of what was known at that time about astronomy, and one was a codification of what was known at that time, known as astrology. And the two were very similar.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because modern astronomers look to Ptolemy and say, here was the first astronomer. And yet modern astrologers look to Ptolemy and go, here was the first astrologer that wrote that codified it. But then you come up in the late 1500s, early 1600s to Johannes Kepler, who modern scientists say is the father of modern astronomy. Because he was the first person to figure out the laws of planetary motion and the mechanics of the movement of planets. However, they fail to recognize that the reason why Kepler was so driven to figure out these calculations, I mean, he was an extraordinary mathematician, and not only figured out those calculations, but also wrote widely and contributed to the mathematics of music and to optics and so on, but that he was, as an astrologer, driven to figure out where the hell the planets were, because the sightings weren't matching up with what was handed down to us from Ptolemy's time of the mechanics of how the planets and the sun and everything went around Earth. And so this was right around the time of Copernicus, who kind of revisioned the planets moving around the sun, including the Earth moving around the sun. And it was Kepler who took that to the next level. But Kepler was a brilliant astrologer, made many advances for astrology, although modern scientists say Kepler was an astronomer, but like many stupid people of his era, he believed in the ancient superstition of astrology, and for that we forgive him, even though he was dumb like people of his age. That's the modern scientific take on it. However, the modern astrological take on it is that Kepler had the foresight of studying astronomy to further his astrology, and that modern scientists still suffer from their belief in the medieval superstition of materialism. That modern scientists think what you see is what you get, and there's nothing more. And that really is as much a superstition as they think astrology is. And incidentally, it was Johannes Kepler who wrote a book called Tertium Interventus, which means third man in between, third man in the middle. And it's really about being in his modern age. He was cautioning scientists as they were learning more about the mechanical part of the world, not to and this is his quote, when looking at the ancient studies and system of astrology and the blasphemies and superstitions of astrology, he cautioned modern scientists to, quote, not throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's a Kepler quote. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, meaning as you let it go of all these other ancient things that don't make sense, don't throw away astrology because there's really important things here.
Gotcha. So what about Nostradamus? What are your views on him?
Nostradamus, although he, Michael Nostradamus, although he studied astrology, what he did is beyond or outside of astrology. In other words, I've had experiences, I'm sure many of your listeners have had experiences with some sort of, magical psychic person who just pulls the shit out of the air. They don't need to look at a chart. They don't need to, do calculations or pick cards out of a tarot deck. You sit down and it's like they're reading out of your diary that you never wrote, and they just know shit. Michael or Nostradamus seemed to be that kind of being. There's no way that his prophecies were all based upon actual astrological calculations
Mm.
because he didn't have the ability to make those calculations with the accuracy that
Ah,
some of his forecasts seem to be. Now, I'm not taking anything away from him. I'm just saying that there
yeah,
are a lot of astrologers who say they do astrology, and yet they use astrology to kind of put them in some sort of state of mind that is not just the mechanics of astrology. They're getting stuff off the cosmic airwaves somehow that's beyond astrology. So
yeah.
that's my take on
Okay.
Nostradamus. I mean, I'm not an expert on his stuff, but I've read enough to know that he seemed to have his finger on something that was pretty powerful.
Sure. So, once again, for the layman, can you explain the basics of astrology, how it helps us understand ourselves and our place in the world?
Yeah. So I think one of the most important things about learning astrology is that we as Westerners tend to place ourselves in space. If we want to go somewhere, we use a map.
Yeah.
You're outside of Los Angeles. If you wanted to drive to Cleveland, Ohio, you would use your GPS or you would use maps, and the maps wouldn't tell you to go to Ohio, but they would show you the lay of the land along the way so that when you got to the right intersections, you would get on the right interstates or you would make the right turns. So you ended up where you wanted to go, but it was all geographical. It's geographical.
Yeah.
GPS is, it has to do with geographics. Astrology is basically the same thing, but not spatial. It's temporal, meaning that we don't normally think about navigating through time. We think about navigating through space.
Yeah.
But astrology gives us the ability to map the quality of time because unlike Newtonian mechanics, where it was believed that time was an independent variable, every second of the clock was a second long. It was like tick tock.
Uh-huh.
Every moment was the same,
Yeah.
and there was uniformity in time. Einstein kind of shattered that myth by saying, no, time and space are actually intertwined. And it turns
Wow.
out that the faster you go, the slower time moves, and
Yeah.
that time itself has quality. And so this is where Jung comes in because of his idea of synchronicity
Yep.
or of the connection of things that we don't see the connection, but they are connected. In fact, the Chinese understanding of time is built on this concept of every moment of time has quality. This is the book of changes called the I Ching. And so the thing about astrology is that it gives us a map of time. It doesn't say this is what will happen to you on June 30th, 2026, but it could say that around June 20th, 2036, that there's a major intersection in your life, and you'll make choices then that may be because of pressure of loss of something that was dear to you that will then put you in a place where there's a critical decision that you make. And whether you know it in advance or not, this is going to unfold as an important point in your life. But if you know about it, it doesn't tell you what to do. It just tells you what the choices are and maybe how to prepare for it. Now, the other piece of that is because every moment in time has a quality that we are all born into a moment of time. And this goes beyond the I'm an Aries, you're a Sagittarius, you're a Gemini, because that's just one particular piece. And we'll swing back to that in just a moment. The fact of the matter is that there is an infinite number of variables that determine the geometry, the sacred geometry that's at play at the moment, the time, and the place of your birth. And when we look at that, we can understand a whole lot about the dynamics of your life, the patterns, the characteristics, your strengths, your weaknesses, your relationship dynamics, your proclivities, how you think, how you communicate, what you like. I mean, it's deep and it's wide and it's very exact, but it's very different than just knowing your birth date. Because when you know your birth, what's your birth date?
October 23rd.
Okay. And I noted that you didn't give a year. Astrologically, the only thing that October 23rd has in common every year is that because the Earth goes around the sun once a year, every year on your birthday, the relationship between the Earth and the sun is approximately the same, give or take a day, because our calendar's sloppy. What that means is that if you draw a line from the Earth to the sun on October 23rd, from Earth's point of view, it's going to always look like the sun is at about 1 or 2 or 3 degrees of Scorpio. So if someone said, Lawrence, what's your sign? You would say
Scorpio, yeah.
All right. Well, if you were a real Scorpio, you'd probably say, fuck you, I ain't telling. Or guess. No, because Scorpios tend to hold information as power. I mean, that's just one of the many, many things that Scorpios tend to not. But here's the deal. Knowing that you were born with the sun moving through the sign of Scorpio doesn't tell me anything about you individually, but it does give me a sense of what archetypal country you come from. Let me give you an example. If you had 10 people in a room, and let's say 3 of them were from New York City, and let's say 3 of them were from Mumbai, India, and 3 of them were from Rio de Janeiro, you could probably tell which ones were which.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't know anything about them. You would know perhaps that the people from New York may seem more brusque. They may talk quicker. They may move. They may walk quicker. The people from Rio may have more emotional component to everything they do and they say. They and so on. And so knowing what someone's sun sign is, that's the thing that's the same every year, because it's the only thing astrologically that is tied to the date in the year is the position of the Earth to the sun, your sun sign. And so we know that you come from the nation of Scorpio. However, the moon, which moves through a sign in about 2.25 days, in the time that the sun is in Scorpio for that 1 month every year, the sun is in Scorpio for 1 whole moon cycle. The moon is going to go through every sign. So you can be a Scorpio with the moon in Scorpio, or the moon in Taurus, or the moon in Aries, or the moon in Gemini. And the moon, in some ways, is more important even than the sun. Sun is what country you come from, kinda. The moon is how you react. It's your emotional response. And so to say that all Scorpios are alike is just crazy shit. And on top of that, then you have Mercury, which is related to the archetype of intellectual thinking, communication, language. And depending on what sign and where your Mercury is and the geometry of how it's connected with all the other planets in your chart, give us an idea of how you think. And then Venus is the archetype of attraction, desire, love, aesthetic perfection, art, beauty. And so where Venus is in your chart, you can be a Scorpio with Venus in Sagittarius, and a Scorpio might have desires and attractions that are volatile and passionate. But if you're a Scorpio with your Venus in Sagittarius, your attractions may be based upon growth and big adventure and something totally different, not emotional. So the point here is that unless you look at a person's chart, not only the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, but there's a whole host of other things up there, out there, that add to the complexity. And then maybe the most important thing is what was on the eastern horizon at the time that you were born. Now, this is actually, the Greeks had a word for that. They called it the hour marker. The hour marker, because the earth spins around and every hour something different is rising. We see the sun rise. At night, we see all the different stars rise. But in the daytime, we can't see what's on the eastern horizon because the sun is there. But the Greek astrologers called what was on the eastern horizon the view of the hour. And view, the Greek word is scope, like a microscope is a view of tiny things, microscope. A telescope is a view, scope of things far, far, scope. A horoscope to the Greeks was the view of the hour. Period. End of story. Now, we moderners have a whole different take on that word, but the horoscope is the hour marker, or what was on the eastern horizon at the moment of your birth, which varies time of day, time of year, and so on. So,
got it.
And that would be your rising sign or ascendant is what is on the eastern horizon. The Greeks called that the helmsman of the chart. It was the navigator. It's how you steer through life, which is not your sun sign. So anyhow, knowing all of this about someone, when I see a client, which I don't do as much of these days as I used to because I'm spending so much time both writing and teaching. But when I see a client, what that client leaves with is a feeling of connection with the universe, because we all have different ways of, I'm going to use this word, constellating, and I don't mean the stars, but we have different ways of constellating the experiences in our lives. And when you know your chart or have your chart done by someone who can help you understand it, you understand how you're part of the universe. It all fits in. It makes sense. Whether you're, this most magnificent Nobel Prize Nobel Peace Prize winner, or whether you're a complete and total asshole. When you look at your chart, it makes sense.
Yeah, I love it. So I think a lot of people, when they think about astrology, a lot of people think of the Mayan civilization. How did the Maya view the cosmos, and what role did it play in their culture and society?
It's a really good question, and it's one I'm only partially able to ask and answer. In fact, it's one that most people, even people who have studied the Mayan or the Toltec culture, are not really able to fully answer because we don't live in that culture. We have fragments of what they did and what's left over, but we know that their understanding of time was more connected with larger scale cosmic changes than our understanding of time.
Yeah.
Sorry. We moderners kind of like the idea of a corporation is only concerned with its annual report or its quarterly report. It's not concerned with a 20-year plan or a 50-year plan. It's concerned with yesterday, today, tomorrow. We moderners, even in astrology, look at our individual version of yesterday, today, tomorrow. The Mayans looked at a different understanding of time that was more attuned to, like, the ancient Hindus, which had the concept of the yugas, this 26,000 year cycle, which we moderners know is tied to the wobble of the earth, sometimes referred to as the precession of the equinox.
Wow.
And this 26,000 year cycle determines the ages. But it seems like the Hindus, who were aware of these, what they called great years, the Maya were also in tune with these different cycles. And, we think of time based upon a month and a week, a year, a month and a week. Those are all divisions that are astrological, based upon the sun and the moon, because a year is just one earth cycle. That's an astrological rhythm. If someone tells me, I don't believe in astrology, I go, oh, cool. So you don't use a calendar? Interesting. How do you get by? Because that's astrology 101. A month is a month. It's not exact because there's nothing that comes out exact. But the time between two new moons was what the ancients called a month or a moon.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in fact, they divided that in half, and that was a fortnight. And although we moderners don't use the term fortnight much, our ancestors did, even up until the 16, 17, 1800s. A fortnight was considered to be it's a half a month, is a fortnight. But a half is a great way of measuring things. So we take a month, we divide it in half and get a fortnight. We divide that in half and we get a week. That's the origin of a week. And of course, the days of the week are named after Saturn Day, Sunday, Moon Day. Tuesday is Mars Day, Tui, the god of war. Wednesday is Woden's Day, which is Mercury. Thor's Day is Jupiter. Thor's Day is Jupiter or Huebes, and Friday, is Friar's Day in the Norwegian, but that's Venedi, Venus Day. So the days of the week are the 7 days of the planet. And again, whenever anyone says, I don't believe in astrology, I go, I don't know how you get by.
Jeez.
All time is astrological.
I feel embarrassed right now that I didn't even know that. And I'm thinking about it like, yeah, exactly. Like
most people don't, we're trained. It's not that we're not trained to think about it. We are trained to not think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's like, so you're talking about the ancient Mayan civilization and their awareness of a 26,000 year cycle, right? So
and a 20-day cycle. They had a whole different relationship to time, which was not based upon the sun and the moon as we know it. So we're tied to Venus cycles and cosmic cycles. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No worries. So we just entered the age of Aquarius, did we not? Right?
No.
Or we're near it. We're close to it.
Within 120 years.
Oh, okay. Oh, I thought it was a lot closer.
This is another huge. I mean, astrology has a very basic PR problem. And when most people say, I don't believe in astrology, I say, I don't believe in the astrology that you don't believe in either. Because the astrology that you don't believe in is not astrology to me. But the thing is that this when you spin a top, it's spinning around this way, but as it slows down, it begins to wobble, and the wobble is backwards to the direction of the spin until it falls over.
Yeah.
The Earth wobbles. It spins this way once every 24 hours.
Yeah.
But it wobbles backwards once every 26,000 years.
Yeah.
The ancients knew that. Somehow they had that calculation.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy.
And what that means, though, is that if it wobbles backwards once every 26,000 years, if you divide 26,000 by 12, you basically come up to 2,140 years. My math may be off a little bit. I've looked at this recently, but that is an age. There's 12 signs, so there's 12 ages to the great year. Now, if one understands that we have been in the age of Pisces, which means that during the age of Pisces, the North Pole at the spring equinox is kind of pointing towards that area of the zodiac that we call Pisces. But it wobbles backwards. So after Pisces, going backwards is Aquarius. Now, here's the deal. Pisces, the symbolism of Pisces is it's the two fish swimming in opposite directions connected by a golden thread. It is the symbol of the Catholic or Christian church. Yeah. And so you have the fish representing multiplicity, representing opposite forces, good and evil, male and female, any two, life and death, these two opposite forces, but they're only connected for the initiate, for the mystics. The other people see them as opposites. This is kind of the basis of Christianity's multiplicity, but only the priesthood gets to make the connection between man and God, or between the opposites.
Wow.
But if one understands that regardless of where you live on the planet or what religion or what culture you were brought up in, largely planet Earth was under this kind of Christian mechanical
Uh-huh.
history
Wow, yeah.
since around the time of the birth and or death of the historical Jesus.
Yeah.
So if one were to take, and we even measure our time we measure our time as how many years into the age of Pisces we are. In other words, we measure time. We're now in the year, 2023, which is 2023 years
Oh.
after the beginning of where we count from
Oh.
theoretically the birth of Jesus. But that's fucked up because the monk that the Pope basically gave the job of setting the calendar to, he fucked up. He missed it by
Oh.
about 5 or 6 years, and
Oh.
that's to demonstrate. But we don't need to go there now. Point is that even if you take the birth and or the death 10, 20, 30 years either side and say that
Yeah.
was the beginning of the age of Pisces,
Yeah.
you have to add 2,140 years. The age of Aquarius won't begin for about another 100 years. We don't know the
Mm.
exact point.
Oh, okay.
But if you think that this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, as based upon the famous song that was part of the music Hair, which was written by people who knew nothing about astrology, it was just bad. But if you say this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, you have to acknowledge that the dawn will last about another 100 years before it actually comes
Yeah.
there. So, there are transitionary things that are occurring,
Mm.
but it's not the age of Aquarius.
Okay, yeah, I just had a thought right now, open to your feedback on it. But I was just thinking about what you were saying right now about the age of Pisces and the fish, the two fishes representing, male and female. And then I'm not an expert by any means, of course, obviously, but I'm just thinking about, okay, the age of Aquarius is approaching, and from my understanding, it's kind of like this age of the feminine energy and things of that nature. And then I start thinking about the way humanity is evolving, and it's like with transgender and the way gender is like evolving into this next form. It's like it makes sense. It's like it's kind of strange.
Yeah. No, and it's ultimately the Aquarian concept is not a feminine issue. It's a neutral issue. It's
Oh,
a
okay,
gender.
neutral.
It's a gender. What's the word? It's not hermaphroditic,
Oh,
which is both genders. It's really gender neutral. And
oh,
one
wow.
of the big misconceptions about Aquarius is that it's this going to be this age of equality and brotherhood and everything's going to kind of be equal, this whole idea of universal kind of relationships and equality, and that's maybe true, but the shadow of that, are you an old Star Trek fan by any chance?
I've seen it, but yeah, not like a super
Okay,
big
but
into it.
do you know what Borg is?
Uh-uh.
Okay, so Borg was the advanced race that they encountered, that when they met someone who was on Borg, they would say, "Who are you?" The answer was, "We are Borg." No, who are you
Oh,
individually? We are Borg and we shall assimilate you. There was this idea of this kind of insect hive mind. And so if anyone wants to talk about the equality or the equalization of relationships and the non-hierarchy, look at a termite colony, look at a beehive. you
yeah,
know and you look at what's happening with the internet, not just the gender fluidity, which I think
yeah.
may be a part of this, but also this idea of artificial intelligence
Oh,
and
yeah.
where is our mind, what is intelligence. And you begin to realize that there is, at one point, on one end of the spectrum, there's this striving for individuality. I am me, and I am separate from everyone else, but I'm also part of the whole. And
Yeah.
so that part of the whole becomes the shadow of, I'm just another worker bee. There is no
Wow.
there is no Rick Levine anymore. There is no Tunes from the Crypt, because we
Wow.
are all Borg.
Wow, that's crazy. So real quick, like, okay, so what's the next age after Aquarius?
Well, that's it. That would be the age of Capricorn, which wouldn't
Uh,
begin until sometime around the year of 4,000, 200, 300, something like that.
yeah.
But it's easier to look back and say before the age of Pisces
Pisces.
was the age of Aries.
Okay.
And in the age of Aries, the god was an angry, Jewish god. He was, the Paschal Lamb, the blood. The there was monotheism. This was all
Mm.
Aries stuff. Before that was the age of Taurus, and you go back to the opening scenes of the movie The Ten Commandments. And you have the age of Taurus, where you had the worship of the sacred cow, the bull, Taurus the bull. The age of
Oh.
Aries was the worship of the Paschal Lamb or the ram, Aries the
Uh,
ram. In Christianity, you had the worship of the fish. It all fits together.
yeah.
And I had an engineering friend who did some a bunch of deep database programming for me a number of years ago in the astrology realm. And he used to say, "This is crazy. You couldn't make this shit up this good."
Yeah.
And one of my interests in astrology actually is history. And I say history, I mean the past 500-600 years, and looking at the rhythms of the slower moving outer planets and seeing how events like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Civil
Mm.
War, the World Wars, how they're like clockwork.
Yeah.
It's not just individuals that respond to these intersections in time. It's cultural, it's scientific breakthroughs, it's wars, it's famines, it's
Yeah.
pandemics. I mean,
Yeah.
these like clockwork,
Hmm.
kind of conform to the rhythms of astrology.
Okay. So real quick, like what is the meaning of the Mayan calendar's 2012 prophecy? Because right, they didn't from my understanding, they didn't have anything after that, right? The calendar kind of ended or
Again, our modern
uh
interpretations, I don't think do it justice,
uh
and I think that in the Mayan concept, it wasn't an end and nothing after that. It was like if you buy an annual calendar, it ends on
oh, okay. It's just start over.
December 31st. It doesn't mean that there's nothing more. It
Mm.
means that there's a new cycle. So I think our misinterpretation is the end of everything, whereas in fact it was, I think, a turning point, but it was one of many, and it has to do with the wobble of the plane of the entire Milky Way galaxy and the alignment of our winter solstice with that plane. And again, there's so many large scale cycles. The thing about real astrology is that there's no one cycle that is it. There are
Mm.
cycles within cycles within cycles. It's like standing in the ocean as the tide is going out, and yet there's a big wave coming in that can knock you off your feet. But at the same time, you can feel the undertow, the drag on your feet pulling out. There's never one rhythm. There's always complicated rhythms within rhythms.
Wow.
It's like listening to a symphony. It's
Yeah.
not just about the flute solo or about the kettle drums or about the clarinets. It's this complicated harmony, what Kepler called the harmony of the spheres, the music of the spheres.
Mm. Got it. Okay, so when I was preparing for this interview with you, there was something that I found online. I'd like to read it. It's a couple of studies that I found. Maybe you heard it, but I'd like to get your feedback on it. So one study published in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology in 1980 found that the majority of the women in the study had menstrual cycles that were either 29.5 or 30.5 days long, which corresponds closely to the length of the lunar cycle. Another study published in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology in 2005 found that a group of women who were exposed to artificial light that mimicked the phases of the moon had a higher likelihood of ovulating during the full moon. So, there's a popular belief that a woman's menstrual cycle is connected to the lunar cycle, but the scientific evidence on this topic is mixed. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I don't think the scientific evidence is mixed at all, and you just clearly stated it. And that is that only an idiot or someone who buys the party line of modern science's ignorance when it comes to natural cycles would attempt to say that that the menstrual cycle, the word menses means moon.
Yeah.
And it's, the ancients knew this. It was a lunar cycle. It is the moon cycle. And so that doesn't mean that 100% of every woman on the planet has the same cycle tied exactly. But that a second study does show that we are also impacted by or influenced by the artificial environments that we put around us. That even just electric lighting, or for that matter, we are constantly being bathed by a wide spectrum of electromagnetic frequencies that are man-made.
Yeah.
And that in some ways, I don't want to say block, but can certainly interfere with the natural cycles and rhythms. You see, nature does this thing. The cycles of nature are never exact to the way that we would like to measure them. But nature does this thing that's called entrainment. And entrainment is this concept that nature conserves energy by cycles locking to cycles that are close enough that they take less energy. It's like when geese fly and geese fly behind it to fly in the drag, it takes less energy if you're already in a circuit that has a deeper rhythm. So it's true that most women ovulate or menstruate to a lunar rhythm. However, it's also true that women who live together or live in a dormitory tend to synchronize their rhythms. Even if they have different rhythms, they tend to synchronize their rhythms. And it was interesting because in the 1600s, a Dutch clockmaker named Christopher Huygens, actually, he perfected what we now call the pendulum clock. And he noted that when he left his workshop at night, and he had all these pendulum clocks on the wall that were mounted, he would get them all going before he left. He would make sure they were all wound up, and he would look at them, and they were all going in different kind of directions. And when he came in the morning, they would all be locked and trained.
Wow.
Anyone who grew up on the East Coast or in the Midwest that has fireflies, we don't have them out west here, but knows that when the sun started going down on a summer night in a field, you begin to see this blink, blink, blink. The fireflies blink, 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 blink. But by the time it's dark, the entire field is going blink, blink. They all synchronize.
Wow.
Nature conserves energy by rhythm entrainment. It's what happens when you have an old variable condenser on a crystal radio and you're tuning it. When you tune a frequency, it doesn't take a lot of energy to drive a circuit that is resonant, that is tuned. And so when we listen to an old crystal radio, which is just a quartz crystal with a couple of wires and then this kind of interlacing metal thing that is a tuner that becomes like a variable condenser, and you tune that, you get to the right frequency, you pick up a particular radio station. How does that work? It takes very little energy to drive a circuit that is resonant. We are biologically tuned resonant circuits to these to harmonics of these cosmic frequencies.
Wow.
And we can't hear it, but we're like radios, and we're dancing to this radio station because our liver is attuned to this. Our adrenal glands are attuned to Mars. Our kidneys are attuned to Venus. We're just basically dancing to these cosmic rhythms, even though we don't know it.
Wow, that's amazing, man. This is mind-blowing stuff. There's also another popular belief that there is a connection between criminal activity and the full moon. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, that's That's intriguing. I would say that there's a lot of evidence, both anecdotal and statistic, about the full moon. I don't know about criminality and the full moon, but I do know a number personally. I know a number of physicians and nurses who work emergency room.
Yeah.
That's their day job, night job.
Okay.
That's their regular job.
Uh-huh.
And when a full moon falls on a Friday or Saturday night,
Okay.
those are always busier, crazy nights because it's a combination of the social. It's Friday night, we can go out.
Uh-huh.
And the full moon is basically a time. You see, astrologically, the sun is objective reality. It's what we see when the sun's out and it's daytime. The moon is our emotions. It's how we feel at night when we're not distracted by the objective three-dimensional world.
Uh-huh.
And so at a full moon, more of the outside is being reflected by what's on the inside. And in fact, surface tension goes down at a new moon. What is surface tension? Well, you can take a pin and you can float it on water because of what surface tension holds the pin above. But if you then touch it and break that tension, it'll sink. Surface tension is how the energy of surfaces, blood, actually, operating room doctors know that there is more bleeding at a full moon than there is at a new moon.
Huh.
It's just because there's less surface tension.
Yeah.
That biologically, that the rate at which blood creates there's a whole measurement. I think it's the Takata. There's a thing that they measure. They take blood and they shake it up, and then they measure how long it takes to separate out into its different parts. And that takes more time at a full moon than it does at a new moon. So we know that there's, relationships. In fact, there was a chemist in the 1930s in Germany named Lily Kalisko, who developed this entire series of experiments based upon mixing metal salts. A metal salt is like sodium chloride, table salt, or gold chloride, or copper sulfate, those big green crystals that you put in a swimming pool, copper sulfate, highly poisonous. But if you take a metal salt and you dissolve it in warm water, so you can melt more of it, because if you heat water, it'll like more salt, we'll go into it. And then you put filter paper in the water, and the water draws up the filter paper, and then you dry it. That each different metal salt, like gold chloride, has a very distinctive color and crystalline pattern as it dries. However, the ancients knew that the 7 known planets, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, corresponded to what they called the 7 primary metals. So that the sun related to gold, the moon to silver, Mercury to mercury, Venus to copper, Mars to iron, Jupiter to tin, and Saturn to lead. Now, the crazy thing is that these correspondences absolutely work, meaning the moon, silver. Until digital photography, you could not take a picture of anything without silver bromide as the coating on the film. Silver captured the light and reflected it. That's what the moon does. In fact, even a mirror, which we don't think a big deal of, but at some point in history, a mirror, was like, it was as cool as the iPad. Someone figured out that if you melted silver onto melted sand that was then solidified into glass, and you melted silver on the back of it, it became what they called the looking glass. It was like a mirror. That was amazing, but it took silver to do that. All the metals, copper relating to Venus. Copper is a beautiful metal. It's worthless for war because it doesn't hold an edge. But it's a metal of beauty. And it's also because copper is related to fertility and to romance, that copper in a woman's body goes up and down by orders of magnitude along with the menstrual cycle. And that even a copper coil is used as an IUD, as an intrauteral device for birth control, because copper basically prevents conception. So the relationship between the metals are crazy. But here's what this chemist, Lily Kalisko, did. She discovered that what she did was let's take copper sulfate, and she made this super saturated solution of copper sulfate in water, and then let it dry on filter paper. And she did that every hour, 24 hours a day for several months. And what she found was that for a few hours every month, when the moon was lined up with the planet Venus, that's the planet of copper, copper sulfate wouldn't crystallize.
Wow.
Now, as crazy as that sounds, a science student for his master's degree at Oxford about 15 years ago reduplicated all of Lily Kalisko's experiments with modern photography, and it all works. In other words, there's something that happens mechanically in relationship to certain chemical interactions that tell us time is a factor, even though physicists and chemists would like to think that something is repeatable and that time is an independent variable, but apparently it's not as independent as science thinks.
Wow, this is crazy stuff. So I don't know if you can tell, so I'm wearing a hat with a moon on it. Ever since a kid, man, I've always been, I don't even know how to describe it, just this fascination with the moon. Whenever the moon comes out, I feel this, like, I say hi to the moon. Like, I'm like, oh, you sexy moon, or whatever. Like, I have this, like,
a lot of people do.
And a lot of people do.
More women do than men, because it's why more women are intuitively connected with astrology than men, because men are taught to ignore natural intuition and connection, whereas women, because they bleed with the moon, they're naturally connected. They're more connected to the life cycle. But doing that, in my mind, puts you ahead of the curve, because a lot of people intellectually know that that's impossible and that the moon is nothing and it means nothing, and so they disconnect and they lose. And I would imagine that if we looked at your full chart, that whatever the sign the moon was in your chart, that it would be geometrically harmonized or connected with other planets that in some way put you more in touch with that.
Wow. Yeah, I wasn't sure why. I've always felt this deep, intense connection to it. Like, I don't even know how to describe it. I thought it was, I mean, I've taken mushrooms a few times, and when you take mushrooms and look at the sky, like, but I knew it was even before that. Like, I've always had, and I just was, I wasn't sure what that was. And I thought maybe it was just because, the moon is the closest body in space to Earth, but now you're telling me, so it's like associated with intuition and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, the moon basically, is the emotional component. It's the water. That's what it is. When we are, approximately 70%, ocean water, so to speak, our bodies, and to think that the moon doesn't have some sort of tidal impact on us. And around the full moon, anyone who tracks dreams knows that dreams are more active, more crazy around a full moon, and around a new moon, they're quieter. Why? Because the moon is more lined up with the sun around the new moon. Astrologers call that the dark of the moon, which is what it is.
Oh, wow.
And so the lunar cycles are way more important. But understand that our calendar, which is basically given to us by the Greeks and the Romans, is a solar-based calendar, and the moon gets lost in the timekeeping of a solar calendar because a solar calendar is focused on the young, on the male, on the objective, on the right hand, left brain,
Mm.
and it's great for moving armies. It's great for
Ah,
coordinating things out there in the world because it's all objectively based.
wow.
However, most of the world's population still uses a lunar calendar. The Hebrew calendar, the Arab calendar, the Chinese calendar, the Hindu calendar. These are all lunar calendars, and it's much harder to get a railroad station coordinated in time on a lunar calendar than on a solar calendar. But it's almost impossible to track the regularity of a menstrual cycle, of a moon cycle. It gets lost in the solar calendar, but in a lunar calendar, that's the clockwork.
Yeah. So, are there any significant astrological events that occurred around 2020 that could be viewed as a contributing factor to the global pandemic or the resulting shift in humanity's consciousness? I remember there was like a great conjunction like happening around the end of that year.
Yeah, the Great Conjunction was kind of the punctuation mark at the end of a paragraph that began actually on an eclipse in early mid-January, and around January 20th, there was an alignment that is about an every 30-40 year alignment where Saturn, which takes 30 years, 29 and a half years to go around the zodiac around the sun once, and Pluto, which takes 248 years to go around once. Well, what that means is that approximately every 30, 40 years, 35, 40 years, Saturn catches up to Pluto.
hmm.
And it does that 3 times a century. And I've gone back to, the crucifixion of Jesus. And you can map the most important dates in the history of civilization tied to this alignment that is, I'm going to call a new moon, which is not really a new moon. It's really a new Saturn when Saturn and Pluto are lined up, and then a full moon, which is not really a full moon. It's a full Saturn when the Earth is in between Saturn and Pluto.
Hmm.
Just to give you a couple of quick examples, Saturn and Pluto aligned exactly in August of 1914, within a few days of Duke Ferdinand being shot in the beginning of World War I.
Uh-huh.
Saturn and Pluto aligned by opposition in 1931, which was when Japan invaded China. Mussolini came to power, Stalin came to power, Hitler came to power. The United
Wow.
States is in the midst of its, depression. That was 1931. There was a conjunction in August of 1947, within a week of India being granted freedom from the British Empire.
Mm.
And also within a year on either side of that. And they always give a year on this particular event because it's a slow moving event. That was when the United Nations was founded. It was not only when India and Pakistan were divided, but also about 500,000 people were killed in the battle, for Kashmir between the Muslims and the Hindus.
Mm.
And there's always religious wars around this, going back to the Crusades, are all timed on
Yeah.
Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. In fact, the Arab invasion of Spain, and 500, 600 years later, when they were kicked out of Spain, those were on years of a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. The last Saturn-Pluto opposition was in September of 2001. Think September 11. That was Saturn Pluto at its opposition, and its conjunction for the first time in 500 years in Saturn's own sign of Capricorn, happened on the day that the first formal announcement of a COVID death occurred in Wuhan on January 20th, 2020. And every astrologer in the world, I mean, when the World Trade Tower was bombed in, or whatever happened then, in 2001, wrote an article saying that whether we get this right or not, the next series of events that will be pinned onto this will unfold around January of 2020 that will plunge us into the next major, shift, like the bombing. And it wasn't because I was a great astrologer. Every astrologer on the planet that followed the cycle knew.
Uh-huh.
And although I didn't predict a pandemic, in my writings, I noticed that there was always, major conflict boundary issues, and that the Black Death in Europe was at a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Actually, the flu epidemic in 1914, 15, 16 was also related to that conjunction back then. But the other thing is that the last time there was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, the sign of Saturn, was within a few weeks of Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther nailing the theses on the wall of the church in Württemberg, Germany, that kicked off the Protestant Reformation. And I think that aside from the quote unquote COVID pandemic, which I have been convinced from day one, not that I'm a COVID denier, but the pandemic was never a COVID pandemic. It was a pandemic of fear, and COVID was the main symptom. But interestingly, if you were alive at the time that Martin Luther basically started the Protestant Reformation by rejecting the edicts of the church, including paying for absolution and things of that sort, for forgiveness. It took years, decades, actually even a century before anyone realized how important that event was. And I think that whatever happened in 2020 was way beyond just what apparently happened with COVID, with pandemic, with government control, with medical intervention, with a breakdown in capitalism and the flow of goods and whatever, that there's a larger thing that will look back and say that was a key period. And yes, there was not just that event. 2020 had a sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4, and culminated with the Jupiter-Saturn great conjunction cycle in December of 2020.
Yeah.
And that astrological extraordinary period of time continued in 2021, 2022, and even right up to now, where there's just a number of shifts that have occurred that are pushing us into new territory. And we're running like hell towards something new, but we don't know what the fuck we're doing or where the hell we're going.
Yeah.
But we're going.
Yeah.
We know we're going.
Yeah.
We know it's no longer 2018 or 2019 or 2020. Something's changed.
Yeah.
But we don't have a clue yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I can feel it for sure. It's funny that you speak of it that way. I can feel it. Things are changing rapidly, especially with, like you were talking about earlier, artificial intelligence and everything. And yeah, it's going to be a lot of changes happening. So what are some common criticisms of astrology, and how do you respond to them?
I think I would respond to most criticisms of astrology the way Kepler did 400 years ago. And that was, people are ignorant and superstitious, and I used to spend a lot of time combating and interacting and engaging with people who had criticism. And basically now I say, I'm not interested in talking to anyone who's critical of astrology unless unless they've done what any good scientist would do, and that is read some literature.
Yeah.
I have a list of 10 or 20 things that I would, don't talk to me until you've read, a couple of books by the statistician Michel Gauquelin. Don't talk to me until you've read John Anthony West's book, The Case for Astrology. Don't talk to me until you've actually know what astrology is, because if you're rejecting what your belief of astrology is just because you're afraid that it might disprove some of your basic concepts of what you believe, and I have to say that astrology is one of the few things, maybe the only thing, that modern science and ancient religion, meaning the Judeo-Christian tradition in the West, can agree upon. Basically, the difference is that science says astrology doesn't work because it can't work. Religion never says, nowhere in any Christian or Jewish tradition do you see anything that even suggests that astrology doesn't work.
Yeah.
What they suggest is that you shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And it was strictly, I mean, you have great theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a practicing astrologer until he realized that politically this doesn't work, and basically turned against astrology because as the great philosopher, the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard pointed out in the 1700s, that there is a huge difference between the teachings of Jesus Christ or Christianity and the church, Christendom. Christendom is the political institution that basically says you can't go to the astrologer who lives on the edge of town to be your intercession with the cosmos or with God. You have to go to the priest who's in town because it's a political issue.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, the Vatican has the largest astrological library in the world. And until the 1500s, pretty much every pope was either a practicing astrologer or had a staff of practicing astrologers who were high-level bishops, cardinals, and so on. In fact, the names of most of the techniques that we modern astrologers use are named after well-known Catholic monks. I'll give you an example of a few. We use mathematical techniques that are called Porphyry, Regiomontanus, Placidus, Marinus. These are all Catholic monks who developed these astrological techniques that within the church.
Yeah.
I have a friend and a longtime associate who went back to school in his 60s to get his PhD in ancient history because he wanted to teach astrology at the university level. He went back to college and got his PhD from Catholic University, which flies 3 flags. It flies the flag of the United States. It flies the flag of West Virginia because it's in Virginia, or Virginia. And it flies the flag of the Vatican because it's under the direct auspices of the Pope.
Wow.
And this guy's doctoral thesis, he now is Dr. Robert Hand, his doctoral thesis was on the church's use of astrology in medieval warfare. This is the Pope using astrology to determine when wars should initiate and when they should not fight.
Wow. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the Big Bang?
I think it happens all the time. I don't know that there was one Big Bang. I think, and this is, although Stephen Hawking is a physicist who I'm terribly disappointed in, because although he did some important thinking, he didn't get it. He missed the boat, like most classically trained scientists are trained to. But one of the things that Hawking, I think, did break the tie on is that there wasn't one Big Bang. There's white holes and black holes. and there's always universes being created
Oh, wow.
out of nothingness from white holes, and they're being sucked into black holes, and that the two maintain some sort of dynamic what's the parity, if you will, and that the universe is always being created. And I
Wow.
think that there's modern thinking based upon the physicist Nassim Haramein that basically posits that every atom has a micro black hole in the center. This is the origin of toroidal energy,
Oh my
and that,
God, dude.
and that the
Uh,
whole dynamic of interstellar travel, hyperlights travel, so on, is all plausible and possible. And this may be one of the big breakthroughs that happen as we move towards the age of Aquarius, that we realize that we humans living on the outer edge of a galaxy that consists of hundreds of trillions of stars, we might just be like the outsiders, like the Aboriginal, tribe in New Guinea that it's never seen a Polaroid camera, or never seen anything civilized. We might be that species, just not integrated with, Star Wars that's really going on. So,
wow, man, this is crazy. Like, I've always believed in the Big Bang, but then I started thinking about it, like, well, what created that? And so it's like, you know, so you're saying, it's happening all the time, like, or do you feel like the universe always existed, like, or it always existed?
yeah, this is tricky stuff. I think
Yeah.
I think that on some levels, I think the Buddhists had a sense of this, and that is that everything that has ever happened and everything that ever will happen is happening right now. We just perceive it through a linear
Linear
filter of our
of
brain.
time. Yeah.
Anyone who's done any, intense, journeying of plant medicine or LSD, knows that our sense of time is a bit of an illusion.
Yeah.
And it's not the way we think it is. But I believe that we are at one of the thresholds that we're at, is that more and more people are experiencing this reality that is outside of the three-dimensional material. What you see is what you get,
Yeah.
linear. Everything has a timeline.
Yeah.
I was born here, I did this, I accomplished that, I got sick here, I got married here, I had kids here, I got sick here, I retired here, and then I died.
Yeah. Yeah.
Beginning, middle, end.
Uh-huh.
And that's just bullshit. That's just not the way it works.
Yeah.
Anyone who's spent any time digging into this knows that Helen Keller, was right. And she said death is like walking from one room into another. I recall Ram Dass once saying that he had a friend who was a disincarnate, who was channeled through other people, but he had a lifelong relationship with this spirit who came through different sensitive beings. And I'm not here trying to convince anyone that this is real. I'm just saying this is his experience. And one day he said he was talking through a medium, through a channel, to his friend Emmanuel, and he said, "Hey, Emmanuel, tell me something. If you could only tell me one thing about death, what would you want me to know about death?" And Emmanuel says, "Ram Dass, if there was one and only one thing I'd want you to know about death, it's this: it's perfectly safe."
Yeah, man. Wow, that's amazing. Yeah.
So I think what's happened is that partly with the internet, partly with, you and I are communicating, but where are we? We're in a non-physical dimension, that things exist. That, if you had told someone 150 years ago, around the time that John Clerk Maxwell was coming up with the laws, the mathematical formulas of how electromagnetic energy traveled at the speed of light. No one knew about electromagnetism.
Yeah.
And someone said to you, well, we could figure out how to take these electromagnetic waves that travel at the speed of light, and maybe we could package physically reality on it, send it at the speed of light, and then manifest it on the other side. And people are like, you're just batshit crazy.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing.
That's
right
what we're
now.
doing. Yeah.
And Stephen Hawking, who says these black holes exist, but we can't use them as portals because if we go into a black hole, we lose our three-dimensionality. And so it's silly to think of them as portals to other dimensions. And I could think that he would say the same thing if he was alive in the 1850s and 60s and was responding to the potential of packaging music and putting it on a CD or listening to Spotify or whatever. We have instantaneous transmutation of energy. Is it physical?
Wow.
No. Is it real? Yes. Is imagination real? Yes. Is it physical? It's tricky.
Wow. Yeah, I've always had this thought or this feeling that humans were so smart that we're dumb almost. It's like we
absolutely.
We look for all the answers out there. Like, oh, let's go deep into space, into the universe, study, go to different planets. Let's keep looking, keep searching.
Yeah.
But I've always had this thought. It's like, no, we're doing it completely wrong. The answer is within. So I don't know if that's meditation, astral projection, or what it is. I don't know.
It's all of the above.
Yeah. Okay. Kind of closing it out. What advice would you give to someone who is just starting to explore astrology for the first time?
Be open-minded.
Yeah.
Don't be what's the word I'm looking for? Don't be overly anal in trying to understand all the jargon. It's like learning any language. Astrology is a language of energy interaction and energy transformation. So when you're learning it, you hear words like, like trine or quincunx or progressions, or just let the words wash over you, because even in listening to an astrologer talk, you can learn things. And by beginning to learn and be open to understanding the archetypes, the meanings of the signs, the meanings of the planets, they don't exist up there. Yeah. The planets are not about what's up there. The planets are what's in here. That in our daily lives, the inside and the outside are one and the same. As above, so below. The within is the same as the without. Yeah. And so we look up there and we see Jupiter, and Jupiter is a big, gassy, expansive planet. But anything in our lives that is growth-oriented, that's expansive, that's bigger, better, more, these are all Jupiterian things. Yeah. Mars is the god of war. Every time someone gets angry, whether it's you or someone else, that's Mars expressing. But it's not just anger. It's also, when we experience our first Mars cycle, we're going into our second year. Mars is just a little less than 2 years old. Yeah. Just a two-year cycle. And so there's this thing that's called the terrible twos. Why? Because as we get to experience the Mars cycle for the second time, we begin to realize that we have the power to set a boundary. How do we do that? We say no. Time for bed. No. That's what the terrible twos is all about. Yeah, wow. It's not anger. It's about boundary setting. Wow. And so all the planets are alive in our lives always. The question is, how do we train ourselves to recognize them? To learn about them. There are lots of good books out there. And it's just a matter of letting it wash over you. Yeah. There's a lot, when I was learning astrology, there were very few books and you had to really search hard to find any, and most of them were crap. Now, there are thousands of books. You can, go on to Amazon and find 2 or 3 books that sound like they'd be interesting to you. And that would probably be a fine place to start. Yeah. So what's next for you? What are you looking forward to? Some personal goals, upcoming projects? Well, I've been writing a daily column on the internet for about 20 years. And I got COVID last summer and I quit writing and I never went back to it. And I'm working on a book. We're actually working on a couple of books. One of them is Quantum Astrology, which has been kind of my body of work. And it's really a book about the physics of metaphysics is really what it is. Okay. And beyond that, I teach a lot. I have an active YouTube channel. I do a monthly kind of forecast, whether you know astrology or not. It's a little bit geeky, technical, but you can get a whole lot out of it, even if you don't know astrology. And, it's just youtube.com slash, and they have the new designation now. It's at Rick Levine.
Got it.
But Rick Levine Astrologer will find me on YouTube. And the monthly that I do, that's a free monthly, it gets about 50 to 90,000 views a month, in that range.
Yeah.
But I also have a large subscription basis that I do through Patreon, where I do a lot of YouTube videos that are private or that are unlisted. On top of that, I got retreats and conferences coming up. I'll be at Omega Institute, which is a major retreat center just north of New York City. And that's the last weekend in June, and it's called it's astrology consciousness at the crossroads. And I'll be sharing a weekend with 4 other very well-known, very cool astrologers. And you don't have to know a lot about or anything much about astrology to get something out of this weekend at the Omega Institute. I'm doing leading a 10-day retreat in Goa, India.
Yeah, I saw that.
I've done retreats in Indonesia, Costa Rica, Mexico, India, Bali, and this one is in December, and it's called An Initiation into Astrology. And that's sponsored by Heaven and Earth Workshops, heavenandearthworkshops.com. And again, if you want to attend that, there'll be people from professionals all the way to absolute beginners. It doesn't matter what you know. Although if you know no astrology, I would recommend getting a book to at least familiarize yourself with the planets and the signs. That would be helpful.
Awesome.
But that's going to sell out, and I'm looking forward to that. It's at a magical place in Goa, south end of Goa.
That sounds amazing.
I've taught before, and it's very cool. Beautiful beaches, lots of things to do. And
awesome. Awesome. Well, I want to thank you, Rick. I want to thank you for your time. It's been a very mind-blowing, mind-expanding conversation. I really want to thank you for giving this little guy a chance to come on his platform. And, you're a rock star of an astrologist. So I want to thank you for your time. And I want to thank the listeners for sticking around to the end. So once again, go ahead and plug your website is stariq.com. Go ahead and mention it, and I'll add all that to the description.
That's good. I appreciate it. I'm always interested in, kind of bringing astrology to, new people. I am at the top of my game. However, I'm one of many astrologers who are really good astrologers. By no means am I the astrologer. It's like so exciting being a part of a community that is like really coming into its own. There's like a lot of really smart people, doing astrology these days.
Yeah.
It's amazing to be able to go onto the internet and find someone who kind of speaks to you and does astrology on that level. So it's very cool.
Awesome. Thank you, Rick. You have a good one.
Thank you.